So, yes, let us start to the last panel today. I'm very pleased and very honored to chair this imminent panel, which is a hybrid panel with two of our speakers in the orbit somewhere, and Peter Judson here in front of me, in front of you. First of all, I would like also to thank Michael Goebel and others who put together this very interesting, thank you, very interesting program. Thank you for inviting me. But I also would like to mention Irina Dubois, who is behind the foundation Pierre Dubois, and who has already for the last years always motivated scholars to put together very innovative and interesting conferences on big themes like capitalism, like climate change and others. And this is always a pleasure to contribute to this and to listen to it. Today we have the theme Multinational Empires, War and Violence, and I start with, are they now? Oh yes, with Michael Campos, who is at Penn State University and is a specialist of Jewish studies and Near Eastern, especially Palestine history. Her book, which I want to mention because it's, it's called Ottoman Brothers, Muslims, Christians and Jews in Early 20th Century Palestine, published in 2010. Besides me is Peter Judson, who I don't need to introduce because he is the great specialist of the Habsburg Empire and a revisionist of the questions we are discussing here. He is actually at Florence at the European University Institute. And last but not least, I see Ron SUNY from Ann Arbor, I guess, on the screen, yes. And Ron SUNY worked on so many different themes and problems, which are all related in a way to our conference, that I only mention his last book, which is on a specialist of nationalism on the young Stalin, and published in 2020. Ron SUNY is now a university professor at the University of Michigan and emeritus professor of the University of Chicago. We have again got a lot of homework from Michael Goebel, and he always says it's one question, but it's all, I have three of them and they're all double. So I try to limit a little bit, but I, of course, give the liberty to our speakers of the panel to pick what they think is important. The first double question is about a kind of assessment of historiography. And the first part is states that there is in recent historiography about empires, about multinational empires, a clear preference for multi-ethnic empires. And rather than, for examples like the German Empire or Japan, where there is more homogeneity. And a good part of historians' recent interest in empires has been driven by an interest in how states deal with ethnic or national diversity. Do you agree with this? Second part of that question is also kind of an assessment of what we know and what we did in the recent decades, is the dichotomy between empires and nation states. And here, of course, Peter Judson's revisionist approach is important. Others have also joined in the questioning of this teleology towards a nation, but also the question in a way that the interest in empires stems precisely from what they were not, nation states. Again, do you agree? I would ask Michael Campos, who is in a way coming from a position which is a little bit more micro than the research position of the two colleagues, but perhaps to pick one or two of the questions to start with her remarks Michelle, it's up to you. Does it work with the sound?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to thank Michael for inviting me to participate. I'm very sorry that I'm not able to join you in Geneva. I was able to listen in on the morning panel just before, so it was a fascinating conversation. I look forward to the conversation that I'm going to have today. So I'm excited to be a representative of the Ottoman Empire on this panel. I don't often get to be the Ottoman representative. Coming from Palestine, the Arab provinces were not considered the heartland of the empire. But I do just want to bring to your awareness the fact that the main scholarly association of Ottoman studies, of course, we're part of the umbrella of modern Middle Eastern studies, but within that there is now the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association, OTSA, and it's only been within the last decade, actually, I think even 7 years, where the Scholarly Association changed its name from the Turkish Studies Association to the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. I think that's one small example of this methodological nationalism that this field, my field, and your fields as well, have been battling with. Of course, the historiography on the Ottoman Empire spanning 600 years and 3 continents is vast, and so I won't be able to characterize all of it. But I will say that this turn towards rethinking empire and to breaking down or challenging this dichotomy between empire and nation state has already been around for at least the last 15 years. And so I did want to mention the important work of Rashad Kasaba, whose chapter entitled Dreams of Empire, Dreams of Nation appeared in 2006 in an edited volume that was specifically looking comparatively at these multi-ethnic, multinational empires and their dissolution, and other scholars in the mid-2000s who also made those first pioneering steps in Ottoman studies. In the decade and a half since then, significant scholarship has been dedicated to understanding this ethnic, national, and religious diversity in the Ottoman Empire, and how this diversity, the fact of this diversity, impacted state governance, state-society relations, law and society, intercommunal relations, urban affairs, and a myriad other aspects of imperial life. I just want to draw attention to 3 elements of this new generation of scholarship that I think have contributed to reframing Ottoman studies in a more robustly imperial sense. First is the multilingual training that this recent generation of Ottomanists have received, which I think is critically important. And perhaps it goes without saying, but I'm going to mention it anyway to underscore the fact that training in multiple languages, not only the languages of the imperial bureaucracy, but of course the languages of the subject and later citizen peoples of the Ottoman Empire, has been really critical in terms of opening up new sources, opening up the juxtaposition of sources, and new kinds of questions. I do think that much of the methodological nationalism that we saw in earlier generations can be linked, if not wholly attributed to more monolingual research. So the new scholarship includes scholars who have been trained in both Ottoman and Arabic, Ottoman and Greek, Ottoman and Kurdish, Ottoman and Armenian, and other combinations of languages. And they have tended to reach vastly different insights onto this question of collective identities. The second point I wanted to make is that this has contributed to a reconsideration of Ottomanism itself, and what this umbrella concept of belonging to an Ottoman imperial nation, an imperial identity, an imperial collective belonging as a sentiment, as well as, of course, the umbrella of imperial rights, responsibilities, and privileges as a citizenship package. Both of those, in my view, linked processes have really been developed over the last decade in a number of scholarly works. So taking empire seriously from the perspective of Ottoman subjects and later citizens themselves, a great deal of this literature emerged around the pivot of the 1908 revolution. Of course, the centenary over a decade ago was a really convenient marker for that, and consolidated a number of scholarly works that had either recently emerged, were in progress, or were at the beginning stages. And so that was a very obvious moment to link citizenship practices and citizenship discourses from the provinces with this central imperial dynamic that before, might have merited one line, in the scholarly books, and of course now has developed libraries of its own. Studies are also going back to the earlier reform period, the Tanzimat period, to take the empire much more seriously. So it's not just the revolution, but it's of course the decades before that, to rethink state, society, and relations. Now, there's a lot more to be done in that regard, of course, but I do think that this more robust concept of Ottomanism and or Osmanluluk in Ottoman itself has opened up this new space for rethinking what empire was. Whether or not that also has a bearing on what empire wasn't is something that I imagine we'll get to in a moment. And the third element that I just wanted to raise in this regard was the degree to which slowing down, so going in slow motion, going to micro-historical and other changes in the resolution of historical inquiry have really been important elements of this changed historiography. By slowing down and zooming in, scholars have been able to add clarity and complexity to processes that otherwise were considered a historical flash, a historical anomaly, or historical failures. Again, if we think of the 1908 Ottoman Revolution, it was considered a failure, so it did not have a robust literature. And by looking at it and refocusing on that, we've been able to see, of course, the impact on imperial citizenship and collective belonging for the first time. So I'll end there, but I do think that there is, just to summarize, really important trends in Ottoman history over the last decade and a half. I'm excited to see how this relates to other fields.
Thank you very much. I give the word directly to Peter Judson, and I wonder if there is Ottomanism, is there a Habsburgism?
Yes. But I'm really, well, first of all, thank you, Michael, for the invitation. Thank you also for putting me in a panel with two scholars whom I really respect and admire and also like. And I'm only sorry, Michelle and Ron, that you're not here, because it would be a lot of fun. I'm also grateful to be called a revisionist by you, because recently I've been called the new orthodoxy. That doesn't feel so good. And in response to the last panel, I want to say, in Central and Eastern Europe, we also have to think about race, and also in the Balkans, and that homogeneity or heterogeneity is in the eye of the beholder. And I also have to apologize because the two questions you've asked are the two that I sort of drafted the longest answers to. I have very short answers to the other ones. But I would like to say that I do agree our recent interest in empire has to do with how those states dealt with apparent forms of diversity. But the more we investigate how the self-styled nation states or the nationalizing empires managed multiple forms of diversity, the more we inevitably interrogate the presumptions on which the empire-nation-state dichotomy rests. Instead, I think we may need to think generally about states and how they legitimate themselves. Many of us have reflected explicitly on the degree, for example, to which this apparently natural or normal dichotomy between empire and nation-state is itself a product of the ideologies used to legitimate or dispute the post-1918 settlements. These are ideologies that gained considerable force globally at that moment in history for many reasons. Now, this dichotomy between empire and nation-state has remained very useful for state legitimation by politicians, journalists, and by the well-funded historians who are willing to serve the needs of nationalist regimes like those currently in Poland, Hungary, and Slovenia, just to mention a few. Those who most often reflect on or critique this dichotomy tend to be historians of empire. It's also useful to keep in mind that historically, states themselves often played a strong, if unintentional, role in creating or determining what constituted forms of difference or diversity. And to keep in mind the situational character of these creations. When we think of Central and Eastern Europe, we often speak in terms of ethnicities and national communities, but using those sanitized terms often prevents us historians from seeing the harsh degrees of difference that they actually embody or claim when activists use them. For nationalist activists, these terms might better be replaced with the term race as we use it today. Maybe because I study an empire whose historiography is dominated by this question of managing multinational or ethnically diverse populations, I would ask of any state, no matter what it calls itself, how does it create and manage perceived ethnic or national diversity? How are those forms of difference understood and coded, both in institutional but also in everyday cultural practices? This is, after all, an issue that every self-proclaimed nation-state constantly had to deal with. I don't believe that it makes much sense to create taxonomies of states that rest on their population's varying degrees of ethnic or national diversity. That very presumption underlies the work of nationalist activists. Rather, the question is more, how do states manage the people in those categories legally, institutionally, and in practice? Institutions, laws, constitutions, rights, forms of citizenship, actual administrative practice, all of these need to be examined. And another point to make is that although historians have been doing this for years, it hasn't made much of a dent in popular and political rhetoric or rhetorical understandings of difference today. Most people still believe that objective forms of difference dictated the need for these laws and institutions and practices to manage difficult forms of difference. Ethnic, national, or racial difference in society, and as I say, these three are often elided in popular understandings, constitute problems that must be solved both in self-styled nation states and in nationalizing empires. I do have an alternative to offer to Michael's earlier question, too, about whether anyone is not a nationalist. I, of course, wrote about national indifference, so I do think there are a few people left in that category. But many people in today's Central and Eastern Europe, if you talk to them, or in the Balkans, about their own family experiences, have a strong sense that goes against the grain and the normalizing practices that nationalists would call mixing. That is to say, many people are quite conscious and aware of their own family stories and how they embody what nationalists would call mixing and diversity. And I think the evidence of this experience might offer us a different approach to creating a persuasive public narrative that goes against the nationalist one. Now, I have to apologize because now I'm going to answer the second half, and I promise I won't say much later. So this question of development in the fields about the dichotomy between empires and nation states. Okay. First of all, in my own field at least, the last decades have brought a renewed interest in what I would call the intimate relations between nationhood and empire. And an obvious example of this is the degree to which empire itself helped to create and define nationhood as a category in law and administrative practice. But another, less obvious example of this close and intimate relationship is how both nationalists and non-nationalist people before 1914 understood their relationship to or identification with empire. Several of us, and I'm going to reference Michelle's book on Ottoman Palestine, which I think is a beautiful example of this, several people have emphasized the degree to which national self-definition often included forms of imperial patriotism and loyalty. Nationalist feeling did not necessarily preclude imperial patriotism, and the two often reinforced and defined each other. Another example from my own field of study examines the degree to which nationalists built their own spheres of nationalist influence and political power within empire and its administrative structures. Think of how many prominent politicians in post-1918 Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, or even Italy got their start in the Imperial Austrian Parliament or its administration. Think also of how nationalist political parties provided the imperial administration with its bureaucrats in the final decades of empire, or how nationalist politicians and bureaucrats actually ran regional administrations. So thanks to the scholarship of the past decade, we no longer automatically think of nationhood and empire as fundamentally opposed concepts. Secondly, and I'll try to get through this quickly, If we no longer see nationhood and empire as definitionally opposed principles, then we also blur the boundaries between the self-styled nation states and the empires as being somehow distinct forms of statehood. This is so much the case that those opposed concepts even become irrelevant in many situations. Now, I've argued that the nation states of Central and Eastern Europe after 1918 all behaved as empires in at least some important ways, while calling themselves nation states and behaving differently in other contexts. In terms of managing forms of difference, these states made highly nationalist and non-imperial claims about their populations. But in practice, they drew on imperial practice, so much so that their differences with empire become unclear. Nationalizing empires, too, to reference the Berger and Miller collection, may also seem like a distinct phenomenon because of the ways they sought to impose nationalist forms of privilege or on citizenship. But after 1918, it was equally the imperializing nation states from Poland, Romania, and even Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany and fascist Italy that blurred the boundary from the other direction. So where does that leave us? Leaving aside the claims made by their politicians, one can ask whether the two concepts, nation state and empire, still serve us by doing important intellectual work. My own willingness to question their relevance is really part of a strategy to encourage other scholars to concede that the conceptual and practical boundaries between them are not so clear as their claims suggest. But I'm open to other options. It's just I've been pushing it in this direction to get a conversation going. The conceptual confusion between these two requires us to focus more attention on distinguishing between types of practices and strategies that states engage in rather than on their self-definitions. And I think this is in fact what most historians have been doing with some success in the past decade.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. I pass the word now to the screen again to Ron SUNY. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. This is wonderful. Boy, do I wish I were there in Geneva with you. I love Geneva. I love that institute. I've been there before. I'd love to see Peter again. I don't know Michelle, but I'm going to quickly read that book because I loved her remarks. I'm not an Ottomanist, but I have imperially transgressed into the Ottoman Empire in a book on the Armenian Genocide. So, to begin, I think that it's correct that a good part of historians' recent interest in empires has been driven by an interest in how states deal with ethnic or national diversity. I think chronologically, the interest in empires, it was there among scholars, but it exploded at a moment when empires were leaving the historical stage. The fall of the Portuguese Empire, the last overseas empire in 1975, and more importantly, the end of the Soviet Empire, both domestically within the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. That was the moment when suddenly you saw this new concept, which had been around but now had a name, ethnic cleansing. And empires, glancing backward into history, seemed to be somehow more successful as multinational states that were able to deal with diversity and potential ethnic conflict. So the interest rose. But in the rise of that interest, and I was very interested in dealing with the Soviet Union in that way, and eventually in a book written with Valery Kibelson, Russia's empires in the imperial and pre-imperial period as well. But what I found is sometimes that the new centered attention on empire was a little bit apologetic. That is, empires had to be reassessed. They worked not only through coercion, but through an attempt to create hegemonies of kinds, with reciprocity between ruler and ruled, etc. But sometimes we lost some of the pathologies of those empires. On this question of the usefulness of empire and nation, nation-state as categories that Peter raised, that's an important thing that we question these things. And yet I find them extraordinarily useful if used carefully. First of all, I see empire and nation-state as part of the continuous spectrum from one end to the other, in which we find we use them as sort of ideal types, heuristically, to tell us about what discourses and what kinds of governing practices are dominant. But in reality, of course, as Peter pointed out, and as Michel knows quite well, they're mixed together. And that in reality, we see nationalizing empires, we see imperial nations, we see all kinds of complex connections. Even the United States, which ostensibly we would largely consider a kind of nation state, what about the way the South ruled its servile and slave population? Was this really nation, or was this more kind of imperial practice of some kind? So the usefulness of the categories always has to be used, it seems to me, very tentatively to see what it illuminates and what it doesn't illuminate. Because they are, these ideal types, so intertwined and overlapping. Now, in the development of the historiographies that I know best, mostly the Russian and Soviet Empire, but then, as I said, imperialistically delving as an Armenian myself into the Ottoman Empire, out of which my grandparents actually came, I've learned very much that what we need is greater precision attached to the definitions of nation and empire, and greater care in using these vague and multivalent concepts, most importantly like nationalism. I am amazed how often nationalism is used as the explanatory of events without questioning what nationalism is. And so nationalism, it's this grand, capacious term that defines everything from themes in the Mussorgsky opera to Hitler's invasion of Poland. I mean, what's the meaning of this thing unless you add all kinds of qualifying adjectives before and specify the very context in which this is occurring? I'm writing a book now called Forging the Nation, the Making and Faking of Nationalisms, trying in every possible way to avoid the term nationalism and use other terms equally contentious, national identity, and so forth. But we'll see if I can really carry that off. I would say one of the trends I most worry about in the recent history of the nation and of empires is what I would call the rise of Neo-Primordialism. Something magical and amazing happened around 1983. When those three big books, Benedict Anderson, Hobsbawm, and Gelder, came out, and we began to question the sort of the stable and the stability of the concept of national history, which had, of course, relegated empires and other alternative state formations to the periphery. And that seems to be something that's really happening, and which I think has to be examined, taken seriously, and hopefully critically approached. So it's an exciting time for the study of nations and empires and whatever nationalism happens to be. But it seems to me, coming out of 11 years at a political science department at the University of Chicago, we ought to take one of the benefits of political science, which is to be more careful about how we define our concepts and not use them so promiscuously.
Thank you very much, Ron. You used the term continuous spectrum for, in a way, broadening the dichotomy between empire and usefulness. In the second question, we come not to a continuous spectrum in the synchronic era, but to the diachrony. That's to say, the survival or the resilience of empires. And here, the contrast is between people who think that now the focus is more why empires were able to last for so long against the older let's say, research question, what's to say that they are experiencing unavoidable disintegration. The question is if we agree on this new focus on the longevity, then it's a question if we there also, in a way, have a counterintuitive assumption that finally empires were doomed. Only it took a little bit longer to have the nation winning in this game. Well, how do you see these things? Are these useful questions? I mean, they come from Michael, so I can ask that question. But is this a good way of characterize changes in recent historiography? Michelle, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me?
Please, yes. Do you want to start again? I mean, you pick out what you want, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just confess that I tend to be a rule follower with these kinds of instructions, so I attempted to answer all of these questions as framed to us, even though this question in particular did not make a whole lot of sense for how I see the Ottoman world. But the way that I tried to understand or tackle this question in my field is thinking about sort of the rejection of the old thesis of Ottoman decline, which was in its heyday, purported to tell the story of 4 centuries of a downward trajectory from the golden era, and something like the molasses decline, 4 centuries of decline until we slowly get to the end, the bitter end. This has been challenged in a few directions. I mean, I think interestingly also within using the Ottoman chronicler and official historians literature itself, in which historians have pointed out that for these Ottoman chroniclers, empire was constantly in decline, no matter what era we're looking at, because they're constantly complaining about the corruption, straying from the noble origins of the empire, and its high-minded principles, or being stretched thin by incompetent bureaucrats or less than desirable sultans who rise to the fore. Obviously, Orientalist scholars of earlier generations who read these Ottoman chronicles took them at face value rather than, as we now understand them, as part of an internal discourse about governance and reform being carried out by Ottomans themselves. So this rejection of this decline theory has really led to scholars refocusing on centuries, institutions, and historical questions that had previously been ignored, which I think is really exciting. For historians of the 19th and 20th century, I took this question really to be linked more to our rejection of the European sick man of Europe view of the Himyarian period, and this current generation of late 19th, early 20th century Ottoman historians have really reframed the focus not on the so-called imperial illnesses as viewed or as defined by Europe, one symptom of which was the illegibility of Ottoman demography or Ottoman heterogeneity, the unnaturalness of that fact, but rather what our field has done is really to question those internal processes of re-centralization, of re-entrenchment, and of nimble transformation of Ottoman reform more fully. So I referenced in my earlier comments, this new attention to the Tanzimat of the Ottoman reform period from the mid-19th century on. So certainly that reconsideration has crushed this theory of decline. The empire was constantly changing and regenerating itself. And you also have this emergence of a more robust scholarship on religious and ethnic minorities that looks at their collaboration as well as resistance to this process of centralization and imperial transformation. So I think there's no longer a homogenizing view of the politics or experiences of the empire's Christian and Jewish communities, nor of their relationship to the central state, to an Ottoman imperial identity, and to their fellow neighbors, which was part of what this Ottoman decline was trying to argue. And I just want to also add the corollary that this is another place where I think the micro or the regional and the provincial are important contributions to this question. Again, because we have an empire that spans 3 continents and 6 centuries, the timeline and various factors were quite different for the European provinces of the empire, even within the European provinces of the empire, for example, or the Middle Eastern provinces, or even the North African provinces, of course. But urban histories, which have also grown in tremendous numbers as well as quality in Ottoman studies in the last generation, as well as other local histories, have been rich and robust and deeply embed these larger processes in the particular time and space. And so I think that this, the wide variation of imperial as well as local sources available in different places. So you might have, census records in one place, for example, but not in others, or land registry records in one place versus another. The availability of different kinds of sources and the use of these different kinds of sources gives us really unique and startling insights into the Ottoman management of its population, into the local Ottoman population's involvement in shared governance, and as well as local intercommunal relations. So all of these, I think, have really, even if not explicitly, certainly implicitly, gone against this view of the empire being ready to collapse under its own weight or obsolescence at any moment. So I'll end there.
Great, thank you very much. Peter, just you can just immediately join in.
Okay, everything Michelle said. I'm going to add something that's maybe a little more superficial, but I think that the presumption of nation-statehood as the logical outcome of history also requires its believers to ask why it happened when it did. That becomes the historical question. On the other hand, and Michelle raised this, there are serious narratives of decline that come from elite members of society in the last, say, 30, 40 years of the Habsburg Empire, at least. And those narratives of decline are a product of the fact that these people's social power and influence and cultural influence is also on decline. So this myth of sort of the necessity of the fall of the Habsburg monarchy, which does exist before the First World War, is in part a myth that's a product of the elites that are in decline. Now, all of this also produced the question of why multinational empires lasted as long as they did. And these questions have produced studies that showed that, in fact, empires were not always so very different in many ways from other states in the period before 1914. In public discourse, and I liked Ron's statement about the spectrum, but I think the important part of that statement was the last part about discourses and practices. And in public discourse, a state's survival or collapse is told in normalizing, moralizing, or legitimizing terms because of its legitimizing function. Somehow, however, the Czech Republic, I'm just naming a few examples, there are other guilty parties, or Slovenia or Poland, cannot easily tell a story in which their societies are deeply implicated in or responsible for the history of the Habsburg Empire. That empire must be presented as an alien imposition on the nation. And anyone who followed the celebrations in 2018 of the 100th anniversary of the expansion or creation of the new states would have seen this. There's no relationship to the empire in terms of history. And the same can be said, for example, with what are today, although I'm not an expert, Bulgaria or Greece and the Ottoman Empire. If we accept Ottoman power as a legitimate and not externally imposed alien part of European history, then we also have to accept Muslims as European, and we can't define Europe as an exclusively Judeo-Christian cultural space. This is sort of a superficial political observation, but I think it has to be made. Thanks to this rejection of the imperial past as somehow alien to the authentic national societies, what we called multinational empires seemed so exceptional by 20th century standards, and we presumed that they could not survive against the heroic onslaught of modern nationalist movements. We engaged in a schizophrenic exercise that, in confirming their inherent weakness, also had to find ways to explain their surprising ability to survive. But even that survival implicitly meant decline.
Thank you very much. And now I'm very curious how Ronald SUNY will answer this, because with the transition from the Tsarist Russian Empire to the Soviet Union, you have a resilience of an empire. You don't have a decline until the late 20th century. How do you see this question?
You have the resilience of an empire that denied it was an empire. So like the United States, the Soviet Union was an imperial denying empire, right? And that was understandable because by a certain point in the 20th century, the very term empire had meant a regime that was doomed. It meant that you were going to decline and fall. That was the metaphor that was used for empire. And history, in the teleological discourse of the nation, which had become so dominant in politics in the 20th century, particularly after World War I, the empires were archaic. And this doom and fall was there. And the Soviets promoted that as well, but only applying it to the Tsarist empire, not to themselves. I very much appreciate what my colleagues have said, and we're all more or less agreed that for far too long, the historiography on empire was written precisely within this frame of the nation state. It seemed normal and natural. Nations were inevitably the result of the history, certainly of our own times. They were the natural form for human societies to survive. They mobilized people best. They won wars best from 1790s on, and empires envied this tremendously and tried to nationalize in their own way. Certainly the Russians did, in order to compete effectively with the earlier nation states. And in the 20th century, there was a whole literature, the modernization literature, etc., which argued that nations were absolutely foundational for modern liberal democracies. And that, by the way, persists in political science, I can testify. So this new appreciation of empires, their actual achievements in, I think Peter was the one who mentioned this, making states, or making nations and nationalisms within them. The management of diversity, often not so good. The Ottoman Empire, my own relatives suffered from their idea of homogenizing the empire in 1915. All of these things are useful correctives. Though, as I mentioned in my first answer, I think we have to also attend to the pathologies of empire that ultimately made them vulnerable to the discourses and effective practices of nation states. And the efficiencies that the nation states, okay, they developed in a certain place in the world at a certain time, they industrialized earlier, etc., but why they were so successful in this competition. Empires, of course, I would argue, have specificities, at least in this ideal type, right? They're built initially on conquest rather than on consent. Now, effective empires very much work hard to create consent, to create hegemony of some kind, political, cultural, rather than simply coercion. That's extraordinarily important. But they also are built, I think, insofar as, again, it's the ideal type I'm talking about, inequitable hierarchies. They are akin to ancien regimes. And what's important are maintaining, even creating, constructing, producing the differences that justify the rule of some over others, superiors over inferiors. And then when they try to modernize or nationalize, they get into deep trouble. How do you maintain, let's say Hungary, Peter, you know this far better than I. How do you maintain a certain idea of the Hungarian nation at a time when you also have this powerful transnational discourse of the nation coming out of the French Revolution and Romanticism and a lot of other places? And that becomes a deep problem, a kind of time bomb that empires will have to deal with. I also wonder if we can't generalize in some ways about empires being more about frontiers than borders, not really knowing what their own limits are. Not that nation states haven't been expansionist, we're getting out of Afghanistan as I speak, but inevitably this has been a problem for them because they don't know what their limits might be, and many of them have universalistic ambitions. And something does happen in the 19th century as empires are confronted with a progressive loss of legitimacy based in dynasty, perhaps divine rule, the superiority of some over others, and so forth. And I do think, and maybe we'll talk about this a little more later, they do move, I think, certainly the Ottoman and the Russian empires that I know about, and even the Soviet. Well, let's stay with the Russians and the Ottomans for the moment. The Soviets are more complex, from hegemony to increasingly to using domination and coercion. So that's basically my remarks. What I do want to end with, though, is, and this is a kind of question to Michel. I worked a lot in Eastern Anatolia, visited there, worked with Armenians, Kurds, Turks, and tried to understand the complex social and political ecology of these three peoples at the last decades of the Ottoman Empire that led up to the genocide. And the view of the empire is very different from Eastern Anatolia, from the city of Van, or from Erzurum or Hakkari and so forth. In those areas, you have, because of the attacks on the old Kurdish emirates, a kind of political and social chaos, a kind of difficulty for the empire either to rule too much or too little, that leads ultimately to all kinds of deep conflicts between the various peoples of that region. Again, what we've seen and what's so beautiful about the recent historiography is the emphasis on non-Muslim peoples in the Ottoman Empire, non-Russian peoples in the Russian Empire. And of course, that whole emphasis on non-Russians and not just on the Kremlin and who was standing on the mausoleum of Lenin, which was so dominant in Sovietology, that all came about only at the end, only when those peripheral so-called republics began to protest and act in the Gorbachev years. And I remember it well because I had my 15 minutes of fame when suddenly CBS, PBS, and even the CIA called up the antique Marxists to explain to them what was going on in the
Thank you very much. You mentioned already a time bomb. We come now to the rupture point, to the First World War. And the more general question is, what role do wars and violence play in the recent historiography about multinational, multi-ethnic empires? But the question, more specific question is, do we still interpret the First World War and the particular destiny of empires in there as a conflict of nations and nationalist ambitions in an imperial setting? And do we also interpret the Armenian Genocide more by nationalistic motives? And how do we, in a way, see the driving forces? Are there also revisions in this kind of conflict? Second question here is again about longevity or, let's say, possibility of surviving. It is a question, is the World War I not also a test for political entities? And Michael here cites a phrase or a question of Aviel Rochwald. Is it not the ability to survive modern great power warfare a legitimate test of a political system's adaptability, oh my God, the possibility of adapting to modern conditions? So was it, again, it's a question of inevitability, but also of the role of, let's say, the national factors in there. Michel, do you want to start? War and violence in your region? There is some, no?
Here and there, yes. So thank you. I just want to put in a plug that I hope that we can return to this question of the contemporary afterlives or echoes of empire, because of course Turkey is a very interesting case and this turn to Neo-Ottomanism and Ottoman imperial glory as becoming a constituent element of modern Turkish Islamist nationalism is fascinating. But to be the rule follower and to answer your question here, again, I think it was a little bit complicated, the Ottoman Empire, because the chronology has always predated, or chronology for violence and wars has predated World War I. If we think about, of course, the many wars in the long 19th century, the violent displacement of populations in the long 19th century, as well as other religious and economic conflicts, So we've had a lot of historiographic interventions that reframe violence that are separate from the final, last gasp decade of the empire. So just to mention a few, sectarian violence, of course, being relevant when you think about the 1850s and the 1860s in Ottoman Lebanon and Syria, although the work of Osama Makdisi and Bruce Masters, for example, connect this new sectarian violence not to nationalism, but to modernity in the first instance and to an aspect of modernity, economic incorporation of the Ottoman Empire into the world economy in the second instance. In violent displacement of populations and the ripples of violence that result from the resettlement in the Ottoman Empire, for example, such as the case of Muslim Caucasian refugees in the 1860s and the 1870s that we see in the work of Vladimir Hamid-Troyansky, this shifts our understanding of imperial population politics long before the 1890s and the 1910s, when that is more often considered the focus. So long before that, as well as the regional repercussions, and particularly, speaking of Eastern Anatolia, as Ron just mentioned in his previous comments, this is one of those areas where Vladimir's work has found that the resettlement of these refugees brings in and creates entirely new conflicts and problems among the populations. We also now are developing a much better understanding of the context and background of the 1890s Armenian massacres, which have finally recently been receiving their overdue attention. Of course, Ron knows this, he edited an issue of an Armenian journal that presented a number of these works. And so, this new generation of scholarship has really offered a better understanding of economic aspects of these conflicts alongside the political, geopolitical, religious, and national or proto-national, however we want to term that, although much work still remains to be done. I also want to mention İpek Yosmaoğlu's work on violence in Ottoman Macedonia in the 1900s, because I think this might be the most powerful work of Ottoman history in recent years that re-examines this quote-unquote nationalist violence. But what's important from her work for me is that she writes, and I'm quoting here, "Violence was not incidental to nation-making and imperial disintegration. It was an independent variable in creating the differences and animosities that were purportedly its cause." So the importance of thinking about violence, not necessarily or not even primarily as stemming from religious or ethnic or nationalist tensions, but as taking on a life of its own and changing the historical trajectory or the intersection of these various different factors, is compelling and thought-provoking. Now, in this regard, the violence of visual imagery, from postcards of atrocities against and by Bulgarians, for example, to cartoons of anti-Muslim violence in the Balkan Wars, to the discursive violence in the late Ottoman press against various groups within the empire that, in many cases, predated the actual violence against them. Those are also really interesting and promising areas of scholarly inquiry. And yes, of course, the scholarship on the Armenian Genocide has bloomed in the last decade plus and is really extraordinary. We have an extraordinary record, from many different languages and many different sources and many different microcosms of the genocide as well. And so this is another example of how I think the chronology and the timeline can be decoupled, as many of these scholars are insisting against the methodological nationalism of earlier generations that might have said that the anti-Armenian violence of the 1890s was identical to that of the 1915 genocide. So certainly looking at these as not fully unlinked, but somewhat interlinked, but yet also independent processes, historical processes, has been an important development of this recent scholarship. To get to World War I think one of the most interesting subfields within Ottoman historiography is the social history of World War I that we haven't had until recent years. And looking at the impact on women and children, looking at soldiers' diaries, looking at the social impact of conscription, starvation, locust plagues, all of these various tragedies that occurred during the war, internal banishment, and everyday experiences of the war. Obviously don't take us away from violence, but frame it in a different way, that this is not about necessarily nationalist violence. This is about the convulsions of a society and facing war, experiencing war. So although the violence that we see in all of these different subfields that I've mentioned sometimes accelerated, accentuated, or even opened anti-imperial, whether it be national or otherwise, sentiments, the scholarship does not really assume that this was the case in all places. And so I think violence has not been decoupled from the Ottoman experience of the 19th century or even earlier, but it's looked at in a much more nuanced and much more interesting way to see how violence intersected with many of the other factors and forces that we've been talking about.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, a longer timeline and a regionalization of, let's say, the important events. Is that something one can apply to Habsburg? Or is the First World War still the decisive point?
Isn't war the catalyst for state collapse? Sorry. Yes, sort of. But I want to also just state my agreement with Michelle's longer points about violence and the studies that are being done today into the longer term questions of how violence is produced and what its meaning is locally, and that does not inhere to the region, which of course was always the belief. And also I would like us all to remember the Easter Rebellion in Ireland. It didn't happen in the Balkans. Now, World War I definitely, and here I totally agree with Michelle about the latest historiography, it's added an explanatory burden, and that burden has produced outstanding and nuanced studies of popular social experience and domestic policy in the empires, with less of a focus on imperial state policy in looking at how legitimacy unravels, essentially, and how empire actually falls apart or becomes regional states. And these studies explore the local processes of loss of popular legitimacy. In the case of the Habsburgs, it's very much about the way in which local people experience the abandonment of constitutional rule and law during the military dictatorship in the first 2 years of the war. The favoritism showed by the military, it's more than favoritism, of some linguistic groups over others, and their persecution of certain very loyal linguistic groups. The serious displacement of huge populations. We are talking about over 100,000 people from Galicia in the very first weeks of the war. Austria-Hungary, as far as I can tell, and I hope if someone knows better, please correct me, but the first European refugee camps that were set up specifically as refugee camps and then developed were in Austria-Hungary. And the first ones were pretty horrible. Later they became, the conditions improved. Now, these studies tack back and forth between the sort of general failed imperial efforts to manage these crises and the specific moments or issues that force collapse from below, or the level of mid-level and local bureaucrats, which is where collapse often happened too, where by late 1918 or by the summer of 1918, a lot of local and regional bureaucrats simply are no longer in touch with the central government and therefore no longer carrying out its orders, and they're taking over. And what I try to point out is that, at least in the case of Austria-Hungary, what you get is kind of regional polities that develop, and I would not call them national polities, although later they become national polities. So it's not so much the war, but the conditions and responses to war that it engendered that help us to understand collapse. Now, this quote by Avi Roschwald, whether the ability to survive modern warfare is one measure of a system's adaptability to modern conditions, I'm a little puzzled by the term modern here, because you might say maybe extreme or catastrophic or unplanned for or unexpected, but after all, the Habsburg Empire was almost completely lost in Maria Theresa's first year in power in 1741. So, and that was in the 18th century, thanks to 18th century forms of warfare. So I don't know about that quote. And I would also think we should remember that the margin between victory and defeat is so tiny in the First World War. Were some systems really that much better adapted to handling catastrophe? Maybe. I'm I wouldn't, I'm open to that. I also think the First World War proved, and most people I think would agree, that all states were ill-adapted to its demands, and the victors simply just did a little bit better. Was this thanks to the character of their internal political systems? Possibly, yes. But being a victor state, and therefore perhaps more adaptable, didn't save Britain from experiencing the only and most catastrophic nationalist rebellion of the war. And how do we then evaluate Britain, the victor empire, its survival in its loss, and it was a brutal loss, of Ireland? So.
Thank you very much. Ron, I think it's a moment to also talk about the Armenians.
Oh, I'm always happy to talk about the Armenians. It's nice to be remembered. When I was growing up, if anyone said Armenian, oh, Cher is an Armenian, or whatever. In my day, it was Arlene Francis, who you probably don't. We were always so happy to just be remembered, right? Small nations can disappear and know it, said Milan Kundera, and we know it. So, first of all, when I wrote my original remarks, I tried to do a kind of comparison between the Ottomans and the Russians to see where that would go. And even though my own knowledge of these historiographies is very unbalanced, in the Russian case, there was a whole historiography that was stimulated by my own mentor, Leopold Haemsen, about the effect of World War I. And it went something like this, to make it simple. Haemsen argued there was a deep social and political crisis on the eve of the war delayed the revolution, and eventually that crisis led to the kind of social polarization that we know that ultimately led to October. And on the other side, where historians argued, Russia was successfully developing and modernizing and would have become England had it not been, I'm exaggerating, of course, everything was supposed to become England eventually. But what would have happened if there hadn't been the war? And I think what was left out of that dichotomous view in that particular historiographical debate was that the war itself ultimately did certain specific things, like mobilize 5 million or more peasants, arming the peasants and ultimately workers that led to the revolution. So the war is certainly important in the ultimate demise of the Romanov Empire. They ran it badly. They had largely lost their own legitimacy, their own sort of political hegemony. On the other side, there's no revolution in the Ottoman Empire. There's no collapse until the Balkans, Bulgaria collapses, and then everything sort of falls apart. And if Hans Lucas Kieser in his new biography of Talat Pasha is correct, they were riding high in 1918. They were signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They were moving into Azerbaijan. They thought they were on the way to victory, and very quickly things changed. The second big difference is there was radical, and Peter certainly knows this, ethnic cleansing carried out by the Russian army in Galicia, and people no less in Ajaria as well. Georgian Muslims were also ethnically cleansed, but there was no genocide. There was no intentional mass killing to eliminate a defined cultural, religious, ethnic group as there was in the Ottoman Empire. And that's an interesting historiographical question. I don't have a satisfactory answer. Why Talat and his cronies decided that they would end the Armenian question by eliminating Armenians, and also, by the way, their close religious brethren, the Assyrians. What we can say about World War I think, is, though I would agree with what I think is the thrust of all three of us, that there was no inevitability that the empires could fall. And in my case, of course, one empire, as was pointed out by our moderator, was succeeded by another one, a rather effective one, until it wasn't no longer effective and tried to over-reform itself quickly in the 1980s. There were other ways to manage diversity. And the Soviets found a rather successful one. They made incredible concessions to ethnicity, nationality. They were the first state that created a federal state based on territorialized national states, giving the elites of the native elite, creating opera houses and film studios and everything, but all within the restraints, the rather rigid restraints of the Soviet Federation. So a new form of empire we know was possible, and ultimately that question has to be presented. The Soviets, of course, did not think they were an empire, as I said. I should also mention, less well known is, they did not think of themselves as a nation state either. They were something beyond the nation state. They were moving to another state of history in which the nation would be irrelevant. There was never a Sovietskaya Natsiya. There was never a Soviet nation. There was Sovietsky Narod, which was a multinational conglomerate of all the peoples of the Soviet Union. That's really interesting. And the other point I would make is that, 2 points I'll make. One is I have been very criticized in my Armenian work and in the genocide work for trying to make the argument that the Armenians of the late Ottoman Empire were Ottomans. That is, they had not only the sense of their own nationality insofar as they did, and lots of Armenians were indifferent to that and didn't speak Armenian or whatever, but they were also very powerfully Ottomans and identified with this empire, but they needed a reformed empire. They needed an empire with some degree of protection against Kurdish predations, maybe some autonomy, etc. And Talat was playing cards in an Istanbul club with one of the leading Armenians, Grigor Zorab, the very night before he arrested him, and ultimately he was murdered. So there was something very much transnational about this identity that Armenians felt, but ultimately they faced a terrible dilemma. They couldn't find a way to live within that empire. And the point that's been made very much in books like Shatter Zones of Empire by Bartov and White and others is that, and a book by Eric Lohr, edited by Eric Lohr and others about World War I, is these empires instrumentally, perhaps cynically, used nationalism to have one people identify with them and against the other empire. This was in Galicia and in the Caucasus and elsewhere. So it was a period in which nationalisms were developing in very serious ways. Now, in an earlier book that I wrote called The Revenge of the Past, I tried to argue that we have tended, in Soviet studies at least, and in Russian studies, to exaggerate the degree of popular nationalisms before the Soviet period. That view has not gotten a lot of resonance because every national historiography, Lithuanian, Latvian, Armenian, Georgian, whatever, wants to promote that, no, we were a nation. In fact, we've been one for centuries, and we just found the possibility to declare that late in our history. But in fact, when you look at the elected Constituent Assembly in November of 1917, nationalist parties don't win. Socialist parties win, or socialist parties with national tinges, like Ukrainian SRs might win. So we have to really question how deep the elite and urban nationalism of Russians, of peoples in the Russian Empire were before the Soviet period, when the Soviets, through their form of empire, actually developed coherent nationalities within their federation.
Thank you very much. I think these were very rich contributions to the debates. We have about 20 minutes for questions from the public, and the microphones are ready. Okay, so we start with you. Take Cyrus and Sandrine, first round. And okay, the young colleague can just raise his hand. Yeah, okay. comes from the other side. I mean, we are kind of marching separately and hitting together. Yeah. Okay, please.
Okay. Thank you both, everyone on the panel. It's very interesting. I had a couple of questions because Professor Judson keeps going to the point of the Easter Revolt in Ireland, and I was wondering if the First World War is an interesting moment because it sort of reveals this sort of paradox in empire between the use of force and consent. I mean, compared to other empires, like Britain put down revolts in India, Ireland, and Egypt very brutally, but lost considerable consent in doing so. And if you look at Ireland, many parts of Ireland were considerably more pro-British before the Easter Uprising, but Britain's brutality in putting down the revolts led to the sort of landslide of Sinn Féin in the 1980 general election. My second question is taken from sort of Peter Turchin's idea of whether this sort of nationalist moment is part of a sort of larger story of elite overproduction in which empires can no longer sort of sustainably employ or co-opt the sort of increasingly educated and westernized population that wanted to join the ranks of perhaps bureaucracy or local administrations, and instead became a sort of revolutionary vanguard. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can our colleagues on Zoom hear? Well, I think one has to speak really well into the micro, no?
If you could rephrase, tell us what those questions were, because I didn't understand them.
No, I think it was for Peter, no? It was about Irish.
The second question, I think.
Okay, yes, please, go ahead.
Sorry, okay, yes, now I can hear the difference. Yes, the second question was, to what extent, using Peter Turchin's idea of elite overproduction, does the sort of nationalist moment, is it a case of this sort of elite production where empires can no longer successfully employ or co-opt local elites into their administrations and the governance of empire, and as this sort of pool of people became better educated but not necessarily employed in the system, did they instead sort of become a sort of revolutionary vanguard in these nationalist movements? That's the second question. You all heard the first question? That was
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that was better now acoustically. Cyrus, please.
Thank you so much for a really great panel. One thing, the question I have for all three of you, some can maybe pick it, is how did inter-imperial competition and copying between the three empires that you basically looked at, how did that play a role in each empire sort of take on nation states, or rather sort of on nationalist and national movements, particularly in doubly, because in a lot of cases you have the same national/ethnic groups represented in all three of them, right? So which makes it super interesting, a really, really interesting case, I think, of this inter-imperial competition and copying sort of, historical phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we take a third one, and then you have the possibility? The mask.
Oh.
Yeah, okay.
No? Can you hear me? Yes? Yes? Okay. So my question is very quick. You ended the story in 1918. So what remains from this empire in the successor states? I have the feeling that a lot of things remain, which are hidden. And I just would like to open this question. I find it very important because a lot of things which are happening in the interwar period and then after the interwar period in this space is very much an heritage in a certain way of the empire.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I propose the same order. Perhaps Michelle, you start and you take what question you like to answer, and then Peter, and then Ron.
I actually have small comments on each of them, but I don't know if you want us to go, just pick one. Okay, so I'll just pick one. So just, I guess, to Cyrus's comment about how did inter-imperial, or his question about how did inter-imperial competition or copying play a role, that's a really fascinating question, and I'm not sure that I know the full answer to it, but it's fascinating to me because I see evidence in the press, whether it be the Hebrew or the Arabic press in Palestine, where they're commenting on what's happening in the Habsburg parliament, for example. So they're certainly looking to the Austro-Hungarian Empire as a potential model for how to manage ethnic and nationalist difference in representation. And of course, it becomes a conflict for the Ottomans because they don't want to replicate that. Right? Certainly after the revolution, this tension between, well, if you have individual rights, what role is there for the collective? And so some groups are looking to the Habsburg collective representation model and wanting to import that, which was not agreeable to the CUP, although they did capitulate in a couple of instances. But I think that this is a fascinating question in terms of thinking about not only from the state actors themselves, what were they doing to consciously copy or imitate or combat, their rivals, but what the local population knew about what other states look like and experienced and what they wanted for themselves. And so that's something that certainly representation and how does one manage one's varying collective identities, whether that be the imperial one, the religious one, the linguistic, ethnic one, was one that they hadn't quite solved and figured out.
And if you want a comment about the question about the afterlife of the empire in your region, which is of course very much linked to the question of mandates now.
There's a lot that one could say about that. There are a few studies that have looked at this. I will just say that it's probably still understudied in my field, as we do still have most of the Ottoman successor states that don't have fond memories of the Ottoman Empire and would not like to commemorate any aftermaths of that. But certainly, thinking about the personal status, legal systems in many of these successor states that they're coming from the Ottoman Empire, certainly we have studies about the architectural and institutional continuities from the Ottoman Empire. There still remains to be much more work done.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's up to you.
Yes. So with regard to the question about the paradox of force and consent, I do agree with that. I can't speak to the Irish situation. I just always bring it up because you expect the revolt somewhere in Austria-Hungary and you find it in Ireland. But what I can say is in the Austro-Hungarian situation, absolutely the brutality and the completely irrational brutality of the militarized state plays an enormous role in its complete loss of legitimacy by the end of 1918. That's true. Elite overproduction, in a way, I would rather say the opposite for Austria-Hungary, at least. The bureaucracy by 1914 was expanding at an enormous rate, and the big problem the empire had was that it's technical, but it had to be paid for by the regional governments, not the central state government, and so they were trying to find solutions. The big crisis of July 1914 in Austria was the fiscal deficit because of the expansion of the bureaucracy in these various provinces, not the international situation. And no, I would not say that it radicalized most of the nationalist movements. And in many cases, it made some of the nationalist movements more loyal to empire because of their role in perpetuating empire. But it's different in Hungary than in Austria, and we always get away with simply saying that, and it's complicated. Now, the inter-imperial competition, and Ron mentioned this also, for example, with Ukrainians in Galicia, there's this huge debate about whether Russians want to claim Ukrainians as Russians, and the Austrian government claims Ukrainians as Austrians and not Russians. But when the war breaks out, suddenly all Ukrainians are considered suspicious enemies and treated incredibly brutally. I think that the Austro-Hungarian self-legitimation, which changed after Austria-Hungary was kicked out of Italy and Germany, became all about protecting and furthering the civilizational level of the nations of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe. And therefore, there's a lot of effort to sort of speak to these groups that are in the neighboring empires. And then finally, the theories of non-territorial autonomy that are developed by Austrian socialists are quite critical after the First World War in discussions about how to manage minorities. Sandrine, your question, some of the best work that's being done right now is showing both locally and nationally the degree of continuity, whether it's in personnel, but it's also continuity in legal systems, also in bureaucratic structures. And I can just recommend to you, if you don't know Gabor Egri and his ERC project, Nespotrans, it's doing brilliant work, and just find the website on these continuities at every level. And there's also Matthew Rampley's project in Brno but that's more on artistic and cultural legacies that also shows the way empire lasts well until the late 30s, really.
Thank you very much. Ron, how do you want to react to the three questions?
With humility and confusion, but I'll try. So first of all, I think I note, particularly in the Russian case, that there's a move over time from the late 19th century to the revolution from a loss of legitimacy and an increased dependence on coercion and dominance rather than hegemony of some kind. And you see that in 1905-7, you see that on the eve of the war, you see that in a lot of things that go on in the war itself. Quite brutal things like the putting down of the Central Asian mutiny or revolution that occurred there. So that's one thing that leads up to the revolution and the collapse of the empire. The second, I'm not so sure about the Ottomans, but ultimately there's this incredible event of coercion, namely the genocide. But whether or not the Young Turks ever really develop a kind of legitimacy or hegemony is an open question for me. I don't know that. I know that they become, once the 1913 January coup takes place, unbelievably brutal. They murder people in order to take power and so forth. And they seem to have trouble from 1908 right up to World War II in holding power. I'd like to take a stab at the question of legit legacies of empires. And there are a couple of things I think that are important, which may go against some of the standard historiographies. One is, there's a sense in which the two empires I've been looking at, the Russian and the Ottoman, were in a sense, though they would qualify as great powers up to 1914, they were in many ways subaltern states. They were not as grand or as great as some of their opponents or competitors on the world stage. And what they gave rise to when they collapsed was also subaltern states, the states that had to create their own sense of position and legitimacy within the international system. And certainly the Soviet Union, which of course was a pariah state for decades, saw itself right up to the end. And in some ways, Russia today, Putin's Russia, still sees itself in this subaltern category, trying to legitimize itself and stand high on its toes to compete with other powers. The second thing is, and Peter mentioned this, but I'll just emphasize it again, is a kind of denialism. I'm not talking about genocide denialism, which we know about, but denialism that there were empires, and what the empires did positively to create the nation states that you now have. And you find this, of course, in the Caucasus, in Armenia, in Georgia. You find it throughout the Soviet Union. The only legacy that is remembered in a place like Ukraine is not so much that the Ukraine you have today was built by Stalin, that he incorporated all those pieces together, but the Holodomor, the genocidal, I don't consider it a genocide, but a genocidal death famine of the 1930s. So the legacy is always negative about the empire. And of course, Armenians have that same feeling, and as do other post-Ottoman nationalities and nations. And finally, two other things. Just as they don't make, this is not a coherent presentation. One is how surprised people were to become independent in 1918. I think Peter mentioned this point, that in fact, there were a lot of, when they were in the empires, they could hardly imagine the demise of that empire, and therefore they looked for all kinds of solutions, autonomies of some kind, federalisms of some kind, and suddenly they're surprised by independence, which we have to remember in the Russian case was often artificially created. So that it was Germans in Ukraine or the Baltic countries. It was Ottomans in Azerbaijan. It was Germans in Georgia that promoted independence and separation from the empire. And once those foreigners, the interventionists, left, they collapsed. There was a very powerful paradigm that comes out of most eloquently in Richard Pike's famous book, The Formation of the Soviet Union, that argued that all of these, the Soviets conquered each of the various nations on its periphery. So the Soviet Empire was artificial, coercive from the beginning. And what was natural was these elite nationalisms, it wasn't talked about in that way in Pike's, that were legitimate, natural, and inevitable, and were crushed by the Soviets. And that powerful nationalist vision remained in the historiographies through the Soviet period, with missing the point, and this is my final point, of how in the Russian Revolution and the subsequent Civil War, social and class elements and socialism were very powerful, often more powerful sources of identity than the nation, at least outside cities and outside these elites. And that's been neglected. In other words, the late Roman Empire, it was in fact certain kinds of identifications with social classes, with certain political movements. It could be liberalism, it could be social democracy, that were far more powerful than allegiance to the nation. And the story has been read, of course, as so much has done, and we're trying to undermine that here in a national framework.
Thank you very much. We are approaching the end of it. I just want to look at Michael, if he wants to comment briefly on what happened to his questions, or...
With humility and confusion.
Yeah. Okay, he says it's also with humility. I think, Ron, you gave the slogan for it. So that leaves me only to thank very, very much the speakers of this panel, and especially Michel and Ron, who played their kind of hybrid internet role very well. I mean, they were really lively here, but we would love to have them here really in person and go to dinner with them later on. But again, thank you very much for contributing, for the discipline that demands a hybrid version, and I'm so glad that Peter is really here, not an avatar, but he is here. And again, thank you for the questions, and thank you for the wonderful contributions to that panel. Bye.